Clearwater, Tennessee. Boone County Circuit Court, Division 1. A Wednesday morning in October, cool and overcast. The Appalachian foothills in the distance doing what they do in October, turning slowly, from green to the specific, accumulated orange and red of a season that has decided it is ready to be itself. The courthouse sat at the center of Clearwater's small downtown, a brick building with high windows and an American flag that moved steadily in the wind coming down from the ridge. The parking lot was full by 8:30. People who hadn't been able to get a space were walking from the municipal lot 2 blocks east, their collars up against the October air. They had been waiting since February. Inside Courtroom 1, 76 people occupied a space designed for 50. The bailiff had managed the overflow with the patient resignation of someone who has been here before, every day of the 4-day trial, and has accepted that the numbers are not going to change. He guided people to wall positions, arranged supplementary chairs, made the impossible thing work because the people outside in the cold deserved to know that every effort had been made. Kyle Aaron Marsh, 16 years old, entered through the side door at 8:56 and walked to the defendant's table with the specific, loose-limbed ease of someone who has made an assessment and is at peace with what the assessment found. He had made his assessment. He had found it favorable. That was the thing about Kyle Marsh that his defense attorney, Robert Hall, had spent 4 days watching from the adjacent chair with the specific professional concern of someone who knows that their client is not helping themselves but cannot stop what is happening. Kyle was calm, not in the managed way of a defendant who has been coached into composure, in the genuine, unbothered way of someone who genuinely believes the situation is under control. He had been this way from the first day of trial. He sat at the defendant's table, and he watched the proceedings with the alert, interested attention of someone watching a competitive event in which they have a stake and are confident about the outcome. He was 16 years old. He had constructed what he believed was an airtight alibi. He had staged what he believed was an undetectable scene. He had done everything, across the weeks following February 19th, with the specific, careful intelligence of someone who had thought it through. What he had not thought through, what no one on his side of the courtroom had considered, because the information had not been available until 11 days ago, when an automated email from a cloud storage provider had arrived in a woman's inbox, and she had forwarded it to a detective, was that Elise Ward had also been thinking things through. Elise Ward had been documenting. The courtroom did not know yet what Elise had documented. In approximately 4 hours it would. In the second row of the gallery, Patricia Ward sat with the same focused, upright stillness she had brought to every day of the trial. She was 43 years old, a high school librarian who had worked at Clearwater High School for 16 years. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the front of the room, with the expression she had maintained across 4 days of testimony. Not the performing expression of someone managing their grief for public observation, but the plain, stripped-down expression of someone who has decided that being present and attentive is the only thing she can offer the morning, and who is offering it completely. She had been the one who received the email. She had been the one who called the detective. What she had heard when the detective played the recordings for her, 3 days after she forwarded the email, had produced in her something that she did not have a name for. Something that was grief and was also something older and more fundamental than grief. The specific quality of a mother who has heard her daughter's voice, documented and precise, speaking from the 3 days before she died. She knew what the courtroom was going to hear today. She was ready. She was not ready. She was going to be in her seat regardless. Elise Ward had been 17 years old. She had been the specific kind of person who organizes her attention, who looks at a situation and identifies the relevant elements and structures them in the most useful available format. She had been doing this since she was small, in the way that some people do things from early childhood that tell you something essential about who they are. She organized her schoolwork by subject and subsection, with a precision that her teachers described as unusual, and her mother described simply as Elise. She organized her playlists thematically. She kept a running list in a notes application of things she wanted to look into further, not a list of questions, but a list of what she called 3DS, with a note about which thread connected to which other thread and what she thought the connection implied. She had been a junior at Clearwater High School, on track for an academic scholarship to the University of Tennessee's Environmental Science program. She had been, and this was known to everyone who knew her, stated in every teacher's commendation, described by her mother as the fact about Elise that she most wanted remembered meticulous, not in the cold, distancing sense of someone for whom precision substitutes for feeling. In the warm, specific sense of someone who believes that paying careful attention to things is a form of caring about them. She had been in a relationship with Kyle Marsh for 5 months. The relationship had ended the day she found the evidence. What she found was in Kyle's phone, which she had borrowed to check a map when hers ran out of battery. She had seen, in the open messages application that she had not intended to look at, the outline of something that did not make sense immediately, and then, as she read further, made a terrible and complete sense. Kyle was dealing. Not casually, not in the small and manageable way of a teenager who had made poor choices about the weekend. Systematically, with a structure and a client list, and a supply chain that had been running for 8 months and that had been producing, by the rough arithmetic of what Elise could read in 3 minutes before she handed the phone back, and said the map had been helpful, thank you, had been producing enough money that the numbers had their own documentation. She had given the phone back. She had gone home. She had sat in her room for a long time. She had opened a new document. She had titled it Threads. What she documented across the following 2 weeks, in the careful, structured way she documented everything, was what she had seen and what she had subsequently gathered. The dates and amounts she had observed in the messages, the names of people she recognized from the texts, the specific language that indicated the structure of the operation. She documented it with the meticulous attention of someone who understands that documentation is only useful if it is precise enough to be used. She documented it because she had decided she was going to tell someone. Not immediately. She had not yet decided who or when. She was still building the threads. She understood from years of paying careful attention to things that you don't bring incomplete documentation to a situation that requires completeness. She was building toward completeness. She told Kyle what she had found on the 3rd day. She told him because she believed. This is the specific, heartbreaking fact about Elise Ward that Patricia had repeated to every person who would listen across the months since February. She believed that Kyle did not fully understand what he had gotten into. That someone she had cared about for 5 months was capable of understanding the weight of what he was doing and of choosing, given the choice, to stop. She believed he could be reasoned with. She was wrong about that. The conversation happened at a coffee shop on the east side of Clearwater, a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after she found the phone. She had documented its content afterward in the notes application, with timestamps, with the specific precision she brought to everything. Kyle's response to her telling him what she had found had not been the response she had hoped for. He had been calm. He had been measured. He had told her, in the specific, controlled language of someone who has considered contingencies, what her options were. He had made clear what happened to people who created problems. She had left the coffee shop. She had gone home. She had opened a new application on her phone, an audio recording application, and she had pressed record. And she had described what had just happened. She described it for 11 minutes in the same careful, organized way she described everything. She described what Kyle had said as precisely as she could recall it. She described the way he had looked when he said it. She described what she had understood from the way he looked. She had been afraid. She had been documenting the fear. She had recorded 2 more conversations after that, both with Kyle, both initiated by him, in which he had returned to the subject and made clearer what he had been clearer about. The third recording was 3 days before February 19th. On February 19th, Elise Ward was found in her bedroom by her mother at 7 in the morning, unresponsive. She died at Clearwater Regional Medical Center at 11:47 from what the initial assessment described as apparent drug overdose. She had never used drugs. This fact, the fact of Elise's documented, consistent, thoroughly witnessed non-use of drugs, was the fact that had made Detective Lisa Cross look at the initial assessment and see it aside. Lisa Cross had been an investigator for 14 years, and she had worked overdose-adjacent deaths before. She had learned, across 14 years, the specific distinction between a scene that was consistent with a circumstance and a scene that had been arranged to be consistent with a circumstance. She had learned to read the difference. She had read the Elise Ward scene on February 19th, and something had been wrong. Not dramatically, not in an identifiable single element, in the aggregate quality of a scene that had too many things present and not quite enough of the right things absent. The specific substances present were consistent with an overdose, but Elise's medical record contained no history of substance use. Her teachers described her as someone who did not drink at parties. Her friends said the same thing. Her mother said she had never seen any indication. The scene had been constructed by someone who knew enough about overdose presentations to make something plausible, but who had not known enough about Elise Ward to understand that the people who knew her were going to look at the plausibility and find it insufficient. Cross began with the people who knew Elise. She found Kyle Marsh on day 3 through the ordinary process of building the victim's relational map. He had been her boyfriend. He had an alibi for the night of February 18th and the morning of February 19th. He had been at his friend Jordan Castillo's house, and Jordan had confirmed this immediately and in consistent detail. Cross looked at Kyle Marsh, and she looked at Jordan Castillo's alibi, and she began to pull threads. What she found, across the following weeks, was the documentation Elise had built. The threads document, recovered from Elise's laptop through a warrant, established the drug operation in the careful, structured language of its documenter. The notes application entries from the conversations. The phone itself had been wiped. The wiping was not subtle, and it was not accidental. It was a factory reset, performed at a specific time that the carrier's data established as approximately 4 hours before Elise's body was found. The device had been wiped, and the device had been placed back in Elise's room. Cross looked at the timing. Someone had wiped Elise's phone in the hours before her body was found. Someone who had access to her phone in those hours. Someone who knew what was on it. The toxicology established the specific combination of substances. The forensic pathologist established the manner of administration. The medical evidence, combined with the wiped phone and the documentation in the threads document, produced a charge that Ada Diana Tran filed in March, murder in the first degree. Kyle Marsh was arrested in March. He maintained his innocence from the moment of arrest with the composed certainty of someone who has assessed the situation and found it manageable. He had an alibi. Jordan Castillo said he had been there all night. Jordan Castillo was on the witness list. Kyle had been calm through every day of the trial because the alibi was holding. What Kyle did not know, what Jordan did not know, what nobody in the courtroom knew until 11 days ago, was that Elise's recordings had been automatically backed up to the cloud storage service her mother had set up when Elise was 12 for family photo sharing. Elise had, at some point, configured her audio recording application to back up to the same service. She had not told her mother about this configuration. She had possibly forgotten about it herself. The automatic backup had run on the night of February 18th, capturing the third recording, the one made 3 days before Elise died, and uploading it to the cloud storage account before the phone was wiped. The account had been accumulating data for 5 years. On October 1st, 11 days before the trial's scheduled conclusion, the cloud storage provider had sent an automated notification to the account holder, Patricia Ward, informing her that the account was approaching its storage limit and offering options to upgrade or delete older content. Patricia had forwarded the notification to Cross with a note that said, "I don't know if this means anything, but I thought you should see it." Cross had accessed the account with Patricia's permission and a warrant obtained within 6 hours. She had found 3 audio recordings. She had played the third one. She had sat very still for a long time after it ended. Then she had called Ada Tran. The recordings had been authenticated. The audio forensics expert had confirmed their provenance and integrity. The cloud backup metadata established the upload timestamp, February 18th, at 11:47 p.m., hours before the phone was wiped, hours before Elise's body was found. The recordings were authentic. They were going to be played in Courtroom 1 on the 4th day of trial. Kyle Marsh did not know Th. is. He did not know because the recordings had been discovered 11 days ago, during the trial, after the defense had received the prosecution's evidence disclosure. The discovery motion had been granted. The defense had received the recordings 3 days ago, but Kyle, who had been in the juvenile detention facility and whose communication with his attorney was limited, had not fully understood the weight of what was coming. Or perhaps he had, and had not been able to believe it. Because he knew what was on the recordings. He knew his own voice. He knew what his own voice had said. And yet he sat at the defendant's table on the 4th morning of trial with the ease of someone who has made an assessment and found it favorable. He had been laughing, not loudly, not with the unbothered theatricality of other defendants in other courtrooms, but with the small, private quality of someone who is winning and knows it on the 3rd day of trial during Jordan Castillo's testimony. Jordan Castillo had been a convincing witness. He had described Kyle's presence at his house on the evening of February 18th through the morning of February 19th in the specific, reliable detail of someone who has rehearsed an account enough to make it smooth without making it sound rehearsed. He had been cooperative with the prosecution's cross-examination. He had been steady. Kyle had made a small sound. The court reporter, 6 feet away, had noted it in her transcript as an exhalation, the specific quality of an exhale that carries satisfaction. The bailiff had heard it. Judge Ruth Holloway had heard it. It had lasted 1 second. It had been the sound of someone who thinks they are winning. The 3rd day of trial had ended without incident. The 4th day had arrived. And what was going to happen in the next 3 hours was not what Kyle Marsh's assessment had prepared him for. Before we go further into what the 4th day produced, please subscribe if this case has found you. Drop a comment. The people in these cases deserve to be heard fully and remembered precisely. Now let's go back to Clearwater, Tennessee. Let's go back to the 4th morning. The 4th morning began with Ada Diana Tran addressing the court on the matter of the newly discovered evidence. Tran was 37 years old, 8 years in the Boone County District Attorney's Office, and she had prepared for this moment with the specific focus of someone who understands that what she is about to introduce is not just evidence in a legal sense, but something that will alter the fundamental nature of what the room understands about the case. She was careful about it. She addressed the court procedurally, in the formal language of an evidence introduction, and she said, "The state intends to introduce, as Exhibit 17, an audio recording retrieved from the victim's cloud storage account. The recording was made by the victim on February 15th, 3 days before her death. The recording has been authenticated by audio forensic analysis and its provenance established through cloud storage metadata. Hall was on his feet with his objection before she finished. The objection had been prepared, had been argued in the motion 3 days ago, had been denied by Judge Holloway in a ruling that addressed each of Hall's grounds methodically and found each insufficient. He made his record. Holloway overruled and noted the prior ruling. She looked at the gallery. "I want to address the court," she said. "What the jury is about to hear is an audio recording made by the victim in this case. The court has reviewed its contents. I am asking the gallery to understand that this is going to be difficult to hear and to maintain the composure that this proceeding requires." She looked at the jury. She looked at the defendant's table. Kyle Marsh was looking at the evidence table. His expression was no longer the easy, assessment-positive ease of the first 3 days. It was something more careful, more controlled, something that had made an effort. Tran walked to the audio equipment that had been set up at the side of the room. She confirmed the exhibit number with the clerk. She looked at the jury. She pressed play. For the first 2 seconds, the recording contained only background sound, the ambient noise of a teenager's bedroom, a chair shifting, the small sounds of a room being occupied by a person who is about to say something and is gathering themselves to say it. And then Elise Ward's voice. She was 17 years old when she made this recording. She sounded 17. She also sounded precise. "This is the 3rd recording," she said. Her voice was steady, not performing steadiness, genuinely steady, in the way of someone who has organized their approach and is executing it carefully. "The date is February 15th. It is approximately 4 in the afternoon. What I'm about to describe is the conversation I had with Kyle this morning." She described the conversation. She described what Kyle had said to her in the coffee shop, in 2 previous conversations, and in the call that morning. She described the specific language he had used. She described his face when he used it. "He said," she continued, "and I want to be exact about this because I want to remember it exactly." She paused for exactly 2 seconds. "He said, 'Elise, you're a smart person. Smart people understand that some problems solve themselves. I want you to think about what kind of problem you want to be.'" She let that sit for a moment on the recording. "I know what he meant by that," she said. "I'm documenting it here because I want there to be a record. I know what he meant. I think that if something happens to me, someone should know what he said and what it meant." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to stop," she said. "I still think he can understand what he's doing and make a different choice. I'm going to try once more. But if I can't reach him, if this gets worse, I want this recording to exist." The recording ended. 14 seconds of silence. Then, "Elise," a male voice, Kyle's voice. The recording had continued. Elise had not stopped it. "Elise, listen to me. I'm going to say this once." His voice was calm, controlled, the specific voice of someone who has decided that calm control is the register that produces the result they want. "You need to decide what matters to you. I know what matters to me. I know how to protect what matters to me. You've seen enough of what I do to understand that I'm serious about protecting it." A sound, a chair moving. "I'm serious about protecting it, Elise." Then nothing. The recording ended. The courtroom was completely still. It was the stillness of a room that has heard something it cannot unhear, that has received information it cannot process through its existing frameworks, that has heard the voice of a girl who is now dead, describing, 3 days before she died, the specific threat that preceded the death. That has heard the voice of the defendant, on a recording made by the victim, saying what he had said. It was not silence exactly. It was the aggregate of 76 people doing the specific thing that human beings do when they have received something too large to immediately process, holding it, suspended, in the moment before the processing begins. In the second row, Patricia Ward had her eyes closed. She had heard the recording before. She had heard it when Cross played it for her 5 days ago in the detective's office, and she had sat in a chair and listened to her daughter's voice describing what her daughter had understood 3 days before she died. She had held herself together in the detective's office. She was holding herself together now. Barely, but holding. In the jury box, 2 jurors were looking at the defendant's table. The defendant's table was where Kyle Marsh was sitting. Kyle Marsh was sitting with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and his face arranged into an expression that had clearly required significant effort to arrange. The ease was gone. The satisfied exhale of the previous afternoon was the furthest possible thing from what his face was doing now. He was sitting with the expression of someone who has just heard something they knew existed and had not fully believed would arrive in this room in this form, who has assessed and found that the assessment was catastrophically wrong. He was 16 years old. He looked, for the first time across 4 days of trial, like someone who understood exactly where he was. Hall had been making notes throughout the recording with the rapid, compressed efficiency of an attorney doing the only available thing, and who has a great deal of difficult work ahead of him. Tran stood at the evidence table and looked at the jury. She did not speak immediately. She understood, with the professional precision of someone who has been doing this for 8 years, that the recording had done something that no argument could do and no witness could do, and no quantity of forensic evidence could fully replace. It had put Elise Ward in the room. The voice of the victim. Specific, organized, precise. 17 years old. Describing, 3 days before her death, what she was afraid of and why, and what she intended to do despite the fear. And then Kyle's voice, telling her what protecting what mattered to him looked like. The jury had heard both voices. The jury was going to hear those voices for the rest of their lives. Tran addressed the jury on the exhibit's relevance, the technical, procedural address that the law required, and she moved to the next phase of the morning's proceeding. The defense cross-examination of the audio forensics expert who authenticated the recording was thorough and technically skilled, and challenged every element of the authentication methodology that was challengable. Hall was doing what he could. He could not unplay the recording. He could not remove Elise Ward's voice from the room where it had just been heard. He did what he could. The trial concluded on the 4th day with closing arguments that had been reconfigured by both sides in the days since the recording's discovery. Tran's closing built the recording into the architecture she had been constructing, each piece of physical evidence now finding its place in the framework that Elise's voice had provided. Hall's closing challenged the recording's context, challenged the interpretation of Kyle's words, argued that what Kyle had said was not a threat, but the frustrated expression of a boy in a difficult situation who had not meant what it sounded like he meant. The jury was not persuaded. They deliberated for 8 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of murder in the first degree. Kyle Marsh sat at the defendant's table and heard the verdict with the expression he had been wearing since the recording was played. Not the ease of the first 3 days. Something else. Something that had not resolved itself into any single identifiable expression, but that had the quality of a person at the bottom of an assessment that has returned a result they cannot dispute. He was 16 years old. He had been very certain. He had been very wrong. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later. Patricia Ward spoke first. She approached the podium in the same focused, upright way she had sat in the second row across 4 days of trial. She set a small, folded piece of paper on the podium surface and looked at the room. "I heard my daughter's voice last month," she said. "In this room. She was describing what she was afraid of, and she was doing it in the careful, organized way she did everything. She had titled her recording Third. She said at the beginning that she wanted to be exact. She said she wanted there to be a record. She looked at the bench. "There is a record," she said. "It exists now in this court's archive. My daughter made it exist. She documented everything she knew, and she protected it on a service she had been using since she was 12 years old for family photos. And the storage system she set up sent me an email when the storage was full, and I forwarded the email to the detective, and the recording reached this room." She was quiet for a moment. "Elise believed in documentation," she said. "She believed that things existed more fully when they were recorded precisely. She kept threads. She organized her attention. She wanted things to be exact." She looked at the gallery. She recorded herself 3 days before she died, saying that she knew what she was doing might make things more dangerous for her. She said she was going to try once more to reach Kyle. She said she hoped he could understand the weight of what he was doing and make a different choice. She looked at the defendant's table. Kyle Marsh was looking at the table in front of him. "She was right about documentation," Patricia said. "The documentation reached this room. It did exactly what she designed it to do. It created a record of what happened and what was said and what was threatened. She was meticulous and she was precise, and she was wrong about one thing. She could not reach him. She hoped she could, and she could not." She stopped. "She was 17 years old and she was going to study environmental science," she said. "She organized her attention and she kept threads, and she believed that careful documentation was a form of caring about the truth. And she cared about the truth. She cared about it more than it protected her." She returned to her seat. Two of Elise's teachers spoke. Both were brief and specific. One described a student who turned in papers that required substantially less editing than her peers' work, not because she wrote more carefully in the mechanical sense, but because she thought more carefully before she wrote. The other described a student who, when asked in a class discussion whether she thought documentation was a form of power, had said, "It's not power exactly. It's a form of making sure what actually happened doesn't disappear." She had been 16 when she said that. She had been practicing what she believed. Judge Ruth Holloway had been on the Boone County Circuit Court bench for 18 years. She was 61 years old, methodical in everything, known in the county's legal community for the specific quality of her written rulings: thorough, careful, each element addressed in sequence, nothing assumed, nothing skipped. She brought to the bench the bearing of someone who has decided that the work requires her full attention and has been giving it her full attention for 18 years. She had given this case her full attention. She delivered the sentence. She did not give a long speech. She said, "Elise Ward documented what was happened to her with the care of someone who understood that documentation was the only protection available to her. She was right about the documentation. She was not able to protect herself. But the documentation survived, and it reached this court, and it told us, in her own voice, what she knew and what she feared and what she intended to do." She looked at Kyle Marsh. "You heard her voice in this room," she said. "I watched you hear it. I want you to hear something else now." She opened the sentencing order. Elise Ward was 17 years old. She had a notes application on her phone with a folder titled Threads. She documented things so that they would exist precisely. She documented you, your words, your actions, your threats, and her documentation is now part of the permanent record of this court. She paused. "You attempted to erase her," she said. "You wiped her phone. You constructed an alibi. You built, with considerable care, a version of events in which she simply died from something she had never done. And for 4 months and then through 3 days of trial, you believed it was working." She looked at him. "She was more careful than you," she said simply. "She built a record you didn't know existed, and it is in this court now, permanently." She looked at the sentencing order. "Kyle Aaron Marsh, you are sentenced to life in the Tennessee Department of Correction, with the possibility of parole consideration after a minimum of 35 years served. You will be 51 years old before this court is required to consider any application for your release. She struck the gavel. In the days that followed the sentencing, the cloud storage account remained active. Patricia Ward had not deleted anything. She had, in the weeks since Cross played the recordings for her, listened to all three of them. She had listened to them in the specific, deliberate way that her daughter listened to things, paying full attention, receiving what was there. The first two recordings were documentation of the conversations at the coffee shop and the subsequent call. Elise's voice, organized and careful, recounting what had been said and what she had understood from it. The third was the one the courtroom had heard. I want to be exact about this because I want to remember it exactly. Patricia had listened to all three several times. She did not find this comforting, exactly. Comfort was not what the recordings provided. What they provided was the specific, complicated experience of hearing her daughter think, of hearing, in the careful organization of the account and the precision of the language, the specific quality of Elise's intelligence working on something she understood was serious and treating it as seriously as she treated everything. She had documented it because documentation was how she cared about the truth. She had made a record. The record had mattered. Jordan Castillo, whose testimony about the alibi had been the source of the small, satisfied exhale on the third afternoon, the laugh that Kyle had produced when things were going well, had been charged separately with obstruction of justice and providing false testimony. He had entered a guilty plea in November. He had not known what he was providing cover for. He had been told by Kyle that there was a situation, and he needed to corroborate the story, and he had done it because Kyle had been his friend for 3 years, and he had not stopped to fully examine what he was being asked to do. He had stopped examining it in the moment that the recording was played. He had stopped examining it, and he had understood. He had contacted the DA's office through his own attorney that same evening. Detective Lisa Cross closed the Elise Ward case file and submitted it to the archive with the organized completeness of someone who has built a thorough record, and who knows that the record contains everything it needs to contain. She had been in this work for 14 years, and she had worked cases where the evidence arrived in unexpected forms. The late witness, the document nobody had searched for, the digital record that existed because someone had made a configuration choice years ago that produced an outcome nobody had anticipated. She thought about the automated email, the storage limit notification, sent by a server routinely to a parent's inbox, forwarded to a detective within the hour. She thought about Elise at 12 years old, signing up for a family cloud storage service to share photos. She thought about Elise at 17, setting her audio recording application to back up to the same service, possibly without thinking much about it, possibly as a deliberate choice. She would never know which. She thought about the backup running at 11:47 p.m. on February 18th, hours before Elise was found. After the phone was wiped, the recording existed because of a decision made years before anyone knew it would need to exist. That was how documentation worked. That was what Elise had understood about it. Cross filed the case. Ada Diana Tran returned to her desk and opened the cases that had accumulated during 4 days of trial. She had 7 cases in various stages of preparation. She moved through them with the focused attention of someone who has completed a difficult piece of work and is returning to what comes next. She thought about the recording. Specifically, she thought about the moment in the third recording when Elise paused for 2 seconds before quoting Kyle. I want to be exact about this because I want to remember it exactly. And then she had quoted him exactly. Tran had built her career on language, on the specific, careful use of language in argument, in evidence presentation, in the framing of charges. She had spent 8 years in rooms where language was the primary instrument. She had not heard language used the way Elise Ward used it, with that specific combination of precision and purpose, with the understanding that the exact words mattered because the exact words were the difference between a record that could be used and a record that was only approximately true. She went to work. She carried Elise with her, the way certain cases stay with you. In the work, Patricia Ward went back to the school library in November. She had taken a leave of absence after February and had returned in September for the trial and had returned permanently in November. She sat behind the reference desk and she helped students find what they were looking for, and she organized the collection with the attention that the collection required, and she taught, in the library's Tuesday afternoon sessions, the specific skills of research, how to find sources, how to evaluate them, how to build an argument from evidence that is reliable and complete. She taught documentation. She had always taught documentation. She taught it differently now. She taught it the way Elise had practiced it, not as a technical skill but as a form of care, as a way of saying, this matters, and because it matters, I am going to record it precisely so that it persists. She was a school librarian. She had been one for 16 years. She was going to keep being one. Because the library was where the records were. Because the records mattered. Because Elise had known that. And had practiced it. Right up until the end. When it had mattered most. The third recording remained in the cloud storage archive. The metadata showed an upload timestamp of February 18th, 11:47 p.m. The metadata showed it had never been deleted. The metadata showed it had been accessed 67 times. 67 times. By the detective. By the ADA. By the audio forensics expert. By the judge. By the court reporter. By every person in the chain of the record, doing their part to bring the record to the room where it needed to be. It had been accessed 68 times when Patricia opened the application on a Sunday evening in November, in the quiet of her home, and listened to her daughter's voice one more time. Organized. Precise. Making the record exist. I want to be exact about this because I want to remember it exactly. She had remembered it exactly. It had survived the wiping. It had survived the months. It had survived the trial. It had spoken in a courtroom in Clearwater, Tennessee, and it had told the truth, and the truth had mattered. As Elise had always believed it would. As Elise had always practiced as if it would. As Elise had been right that it did. Exactly.